Imagine waking up one morning and by nightfall, half your street is dead. Not sick, dead. Now imagine that happening every single day for 7 years straight. That's not a horror movie premise. That's Tuesday in medieval Europe, circa 1347. The Black Death is the most catastrophic event in human history. More people died in a shorter period of time than in any war, any famine, any disaster before or since. But here's what your history class never told you. The death toll was just the beginning. To understand what the Black Death actually did to Europe, you first need to understand the world it walked into. By the early 1300s, Europe was thriving. Population was booming. Cities were growing. Trade routes stretched from England all the way to China. Cathedrals were being built. Universities were opening. For medieval standards, things were genuinely looking up. And then the weather changed. Between 1315 and 1322, Europe experienced something called the Great Famine. Temperatures dropped. Crops failed. For 7 years, harvests across the entire continent came up short. People starved. Livestock died. Entire villages were wiped out before a single flea ever showed up. Historians estimate the Great Famine killed 10 to 15% of Europe's population. So by the time the plague arrived, Europe was already on its knees, malnourished, weakened, packed into cities with no sewage systems, no clean water, and absolutely no understanding of how disease actually spread. It was the perfect storm. And something was already moving west. The plague didn't start in Europe. It started somewhere in Central Asia, modern-day Kyrgyzstan, based on recent archaeological evidence from burial sites dating to 1338 and 1339, 2 years before it hit Europe. Those burial inscriptions mention a pestilence. Historians spent decades arguing about exactly where Ground Zero was. In 2022, researchers finally confirmed it. The graves, the DNA, the bacterium. It was Yersinia pestis, the plague bacterium. And it had been quietly building for years before it went global. It traveled west along the Silk Road, the ancient trade network connecting Asia to Europe. Merchants, caravans, rats and fleas carrying a passenger none of them could see. In 1346, it reached the Crimean port of Kaffa on the Black Sea. And here's where it gets cinematic. Kaffa was under siege by a Mongol army. The Mongols had the city surrounded, cutting off supplies, waiting them out. And then the plague hit the Mongol camp. Soldiers started dying by the hundreds. The siege was falling apart, and in what historians now consider one of the first acts of biological warfare in recorded history, the Mongol commanders ordered the catapults loaded with plague-infected corpses. They launched them over the city walls. The people inside Kaffa were already terrified. Now bodies were raining down on them, rotting, infectious, inescapable. The Genoese merchants inside the city fled to their ships and sailed west. They thought they were escaping. They were carrying it with them. October 1347. 12 Genoese trading ships dock at the port of Messina in Sicily. The port officials who came to greet them made a discovery that they would never forget. Most of the sailors were dead. The ones still alive were covered in black boils, swollen lymph nodes the size of eggs, oozing blood and pus from the armpits, the neck, the groin. Their skin was covered in dark blotches. They were delirious, burning with fever. Most were barely conscious. The port officials ordered the ships out of the harbor immediately. It was already too late. Within days, people in Messina were dying. Within weeks, it had spread across Sicily. By the end of 1347, it had crossed the Mediterranean to mainland Italy. And Italy in 1347 was the most densely populated most commercially active region in Europe. The worst possible place for a plague to land. Florence, Genoa, Venice. These were the beating hearts of European trade, which meant they were also the beating hearts of European infection. The Venetians were actually the first to develop a response. They quarantined arriving ships for 30 days, later extended to 40, which is where the word quarantine comes from. 40 giorni, 40 days. It didn't work, because nobody knew that the real carrier wasn't the sick sailor standing in front of you. It was the flea on the rat that came off the ship 3 days before he did. Here's the part that gets left out of most history classes because it's genuinely difficult to describe without sounding like you're writing a horror novel. The plague came in 3 forms. The most common was bubonic plague, named for the buboes, those swollen lymph nodes that appeared first. They started small. Within days they could grow to the size of an apple. They were excruciatingly painful. The skin around them turned black from internal bleeding. Hence, the Black Death. Fever, chills, vomiting, the body essentially turning on itself. Without treatment, bubonic plague killed between 30 and 60% of the people who caught it, usually within 2 to 7 days of the first symptoms. But the bubonic form wasn't the worst one. Pneumonic plague spread through the air, through breath, through coughing. No flea required, just proximity to another infected person. It attacked the lungs directly. The death rate for pneumonic plague was close to 100%. And then there was septicemic plague, the rarest and fastest. The bacterium entered the bloodstream directly and spread so rapidly that people died before they even developed the characteristic boils. There are documented accounts of people going to bed feeling fine and never waking up. Now here's the part that nobody told you in school. Medieval people had absolutely no framework for understanding any of this. There was no germ theory, no microscopes, no concept of bacteria or viruses. The most educated physicians in Europe genuinely believed the plague was caused by bad air, miasma rising from the earth. Some blamed the alignment of planets. In 1348, the medical faculty of the University of Paris issued an official statement blaming a conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter and Mars in 1345 for corrupting the atmosphere. Others blamed earthquakes releasing poisonous fumes from the ground, and a horrifying number blamed the Jews. This is where the Black Death stops being a medical story and becomes something much darker. When you tell people they're dying and nobody knows why, they start looking for someone to blame. In 1348 and 1349, across Germany, France, and Switzerland, Jewish communities were accused of poisoning the wells, of causing the plague deliberately, of being agents of the devil. What followed was a wave of massacres that historians call the Black Death persecutions. In Strasbourg, in February 1349, 2,000 Jewish residents were rounded up, taken to the local cemetery and burned alive. This happened while the plague hadn't even reached Strasbourg yet. In Mainz, in Cologne, in hundreds of towns across Europe, Jewish communities that had existed for centuries were wiped out within months. Pope Clement VI issued 2 papal bulls stating clearly that Jewish people were not responsible for the plague, pointing out correctly that they were dying from it too. Nobody listened. Meanwhile, another response was spreading across Europe that is one of the most disturbing things I've ever researched. The Flagellants. Groups of men, sometimes hundreds, sometimes thousands, who traveled from town to town publicly whipping themselves, beating their own backs with leather straps studded with metal spikes, drawing blood, chanting, performing rituals of extreme self-punishment in public squares. The logic was theological. God was punishing humanity for its sins. The only way to stop the plague was to demonstrate suffering, to show God that you were already punishing yourself so he didn't have to. They traveled constantly, town to town, carrying the plague with them. And in a catastrophic irony, they almost certainly accelerated its spread. Let me give you some numbers, because I think this is the part that genuinely doesn't land until you sit with it. Before the Black Death, Europe's population was approximately 75 million people. By 1353, when the worst of the first wave had passed, estimates suggest between 30 and 50 million of them were dead. That's somewhere between 40 and 60% of the entire continent. Gone in 6 years. In England, the population didn't recover to pre-plague levels until the 1700s, 3.5 centuries later. Some regions were hit even harder. Parts of Italy lost 70 to 80% of their population. Florence went from 110,000 people to 50,000 in 18 months. The chronicler Giovanni Boccaccio, who survived and wrote about it, described carts piled with bodies being wheeled through the streets at night. Grave diggers who couldn't keep up. Bodies left in houses for days because there was nobody left to move them. He described dogs dragging corpses through the streets. The social fabric didn't just fray, it disintegrated. Priests refused to give last rites because they were terrified of infection. Doctors stopped making house calls. Families abandoned sick relatives. Parents left children. Some people believed the best medicine was to drink heavily, sing, and avoid all thought of death. Others locked themselves in their homes and refused all contact with the outside world. Neither worked. Here's the part that genuinely doesn't make it into most history books. The Black Death didn't just kill people. It fundamentally restructured human civilization. And some of what it changed is deeply uncomfortable to acknowledge. With half the workforce dead, the surviving peasants suddenly had something they had never had before: leverage. They could demand higher wages, better conditions. Lords who refused found their fields unworked and their crops rotting. The feudal system, the entire medieval social order, built on the idea that peasants existed to serve the nobility, began to collapse. Not immediately, not without violence, but the Black Death planted the seed of something that looked uncomfortably like workers' rights. The church took a catastrophic credibility hit. Priests and bishops had died alongside everyone else. Prayer had not worked. The official explanations had been wrong. For millions of Europeans, the plague was the moment they started quietly questioning whether the church actually had the answers it claimed to have. Some historians argue the Black Death was a significant catalyst for the Renaissance and eventually the Reformation, the collapse of old certainties, creating space for new ideas. And then there's the thing nobody wants to say out loud. The plague kept coming back. Throughout the 1400s, the plague became a permanent feature of European life for 300 years. The last major outbreak in Western Europe was the Great Plague of London in 1665, 3 centuries after the Black Death first arrived. 3 centuries of recurring death, of communities rebuilding and then being devastated again. The Black Death wasn't an event, it was an era. Yersinia pestis still exists. The bacterium that caused the Black Death is still present in wild rodent populations in parts of Asia, Africa, and the American Southwest. Cases are still reported every year. In 2020, a boy in Mongolia died of bubonic plague after eating an infected marmot. The difference between the 14th century and now isn't that the plague is gone, it's that we have antibiotics, we have germ theory, we have public health infrastructure, we know what we're fighting. The people of medieval Europe died in the tens of millions, not just because a bacterium was deadly, but because they had no idea what it was no idea how it spread, and no way to coordinate a response. Sound familiar? The Black Death is the most extreme case study in human history of what happens when a pathogen meets a population that is malnourished, crowded, misinformed, and convinced that the answer lies in blaming their neighbors rather than understanding the actual problem. It's not just history. It's a warning. If that one got under your skin, good. It should. This is what this channel is for. The real story. The parts that are too uncomfortable, too complex, or too human to fit neatly into a textbook chapter. Next week, we go inside the most disturbing mystery in modern history. 9 hikers fled their tent in -30-degree temperatures in the middle of the night and were found dead weeks later, scattered across a Siberian mountain. Their tent had been cut open from the inside. No footprints led away, and the Soviet government buried the investigation for 30 years. The Dyatlov Pass incident. And I promise you the truth is stranger than any explanation you've heard. Subscribe so you don't miss it. Drop a comment telling me what hit hardest in this one. I read every single one. I'll see you in the dark.